Welcome, everyone, to DEI After 5, the show that focuses on topics across diversity, equity, and inclusion with some of the brightest minds in the industry. Here's your hostess, inclusive culture curator and coach, Sacha Thompson.
Hello and welcome to DEI After 5. This episode really is one that I am excited to unpack. We are now in this time, and we've found ourselves in these times, right, where there has been uncertainty, unrest, not quite sure what's going to happen tomorrow. And as leaders within our organizations, be it work, be it community, whatever it is, there's this unease of, okay, what do we do? How do we move forward? How do we figure out what our next steps are when we don't even know what the ground will look like in front of us? And so I want to unpack that a little bit today with my guest, who is Nancy Lyons, who is the CEO and co-founder of Clockwork. And I want to really start to look at, how do we create these environments, right, across the board where everyone belongs, regardless of what is happening in the world. So Nancy, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Sacha. Thanks for having me.
Wonderful. So for those who may not know who you are, can you give us a little bit of who you are and how you got into the space?
Sure. Well, I'm Nancy Lyons. I live in Minneapolis, Minnesota. I am a co-founder and CEO of Clockwork, which is an experience design and technology consultancy. And really what that means is we solve big, gnarly problems for the enterprise using technology and strategy and change solutions. So we help clients implement technology solutions, and then we bring people along with us. I also do public speaking. I've written a book, all the stuff you do.
All the things. Wonderful. So, I started this by talking about I always wanted to say unprecedented times, but I feel like we're always here every few years. Mm-hmm. But this one feels different. And what I realized in this particular election season is, though there's uncertainty, this hits us in different ways throughout the year, right? Mm-hmm. There are different conflicts that have happened across the world, across our country, that impact us and individuals within our communities in different ways. And so as leaders, how do we start to address this uncertainty, right? How do we step out boldly when we don't even know what we're stepping out into?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's important to name it. I think it's important to speak to it and not make it a special conversation that happens around, certain events, but to continually speak to this idea that, people are confused and they're troubled and they're struggling and everybody has their own, set of issues. And there is, definite divisiveness that seems to have seeped through our entire culture. I also heard this term yesterday. I'm a big believer in psychological safety. And one of the things that I'm constantly trying to, one of the things that I'm constantly trying to do is, remind people that we're all accountable for how people feel in the workplace. It's not just about leaders establishing, culture. It's about all of us being aware and maintaining and being sensitive to. And I heard this term yesterday when I was speaking at an event, that was sort of an extension of psychological safety. And it was psychological first aid, which I thought was interesting. And it made me think about, opportunities where it's not just safety that we can assume, but it's first aid that we need to administer, which means a little extra, sensitivity, openness, acceptance, but just availability, being available for people to speak their truth about, what they might be feeling, or where they might not feel like they're able to show up as their
Mhm.
whole selves, or and I think my perception of the difference between those two things is psychological safety is something we're always striving to create for everyone, and psychological first aid means just being aware of what's happening in the world and recognizing when people need just a little bit of energy, a little bit of
Yeah.
time, and space to move through whatever it is they're dealing with.
I love that. Anyone that has followed me, like my work, my day-to-day work is around psychological safety, right? And
Mhm.
helping organizations build that. And what I've been very intentional with lately is going beyond just talking to leaders, right? We do the leadership training there, but to your point, we've added on a whole area of what does this look like for teams?
Mhm.
And our responsibility as team members to ensure psychological safety for others.
Mhm.
And so that speaks directly to that first aid, because I have heard time and time again going into organizations, and we have this way of weaponizing phrases, right? We when we hear them, and so it's like, oh, I don't feel psychologically safe. But then when I start to dig and unpack, and I'm like, well, you're the one acting the fool. Like, you're the one that's causing hell for everyone else. And so, how do we look at our responsibility in creating this environment that we are a part of? But two, what you're saying is, how are we aware and cognizant of what's happening in the environment around us that may impact how someone shows up? And so when I think of first aid, there's a level of healing, there's a level of protection, there's a level of really being intentional about how we show up with and for other people.
Mhm.
And so that then creates this almost barrier. I'm thinking of a band-aid, right? Like this barrier of protection that is so needed in this space. So I wrote that down. Like, yep, I love I love that phrase as well too. Um, so what is also critical about what you said is it is a responsibility, and I think many people feel, or I've seen this, it's the leader's responsibility. I'm of the school, everybody's a leader. You could lead from whatever seat you are in, you are a leader. So if it is the leader's responsibility, it is your responsibility as well. Um, but what happens when the leader is not very tied into what's happening in the world around them, is very focused on productivity, because that tends to happen. I think people, um, when they don't know the answers, they go to their safe space, which is, let me just focus on the work. Let me just focus on checking these boxes to make sure the stuff that gets done, because I can't deal with the emotions. I can't deal with the uncertainty myself. I can't deal with what I don't know. And so what would you say to a leader that's kind of in that space of, I'm in this position, but I don't want to deal with it.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I would question a leader who couldn't acknowledge the truth about what people need. I think that you can't focus on productivity without understanding that you get your best productivity when people feel safe. That people can't be numbers. We have to recognize that they are complicated, they are complex. All sorts of external forces influence how they feel and how they show up. And I believe that it is critical to a leader it's critical for a leader to recognize that and acknowledge it, because the other thing that I think happens is, if nobody says it out loud, it's a very isolating feeling and
Mm,
energy. And some people might feel that they're the only ones experiencing things this way. There's also this implication of weakness. And nobody wants to feel weak in their jobs. I agree with you. One of the threads that runs through all of the content that I create is this idea that we must all show up in a leaderly way. We cannot, especially at the pace at which work moves, the way that work is so distributed, the pressure that's on everybody, and the external forces that influence how we feel. We cannot leave leadership to a tiny layer of any organization. It doesn't work. We need people who are willing to take risks, to put themselves out there, to take initiative, to look around and see how they can add value, to be solution focused. And sometimes, the process is how we do our jobs. That is established, but who we are when we show up to do them, that is influenced by external factors. And I believe that leaders have to be aware of those things, and it takes courage to be a good leader. And I also believe that some of what's happening in the world right now is really about cowardice. In my business, we make digital products for people, and the only way that we can ensure that those products speak to and work for the diverse audiences that they're distributed to is if our workforce reflects those audiences. And that's just the reality of how we work. But recognizing too that the diversity of that audience requires more than a homogenized approach to how they are led. Their life experiences, their lived experiences, their homes, their histories, they're all different and glorious in their own right. And a good leader must recognize that and has to speak to that diversity. And frankly, I use the word diversity to describe the reality, the variety of experience. I don't often use the word diversity in my day-to-day work because I feel like people equate that to a number or a quota. And people are not numbers. And what I really want people to focus on, and the example that we try to set, because obviously we're not a DEI company, but I am of the belief that businesses can be examples and lead by how they show up in the world, but also how they speak in the world. I'm going to assume that you and I are a similar generation. Perhaps I'm a Gen Xer, and I grew up believing that, I grew up professionally in my early career believing that in order to make everybody happy, you just don't say any of the stuff that bothers people. But the truth of the matter is, you're never going to make everybody happy. And there are clients that we should not work with because they don't share our values. And we have to make some difficult decisions and really put a stake in the ground and establish who we are and what our brand stands for, and then set an example for other businesses, because it doesn't make sense to try to be all things to all people. And so that's what we do. So I guess, my answer might be a non-answer to your question, but frankly, I don't feel like those people are leading as effectively as they could if they ignore the truth about what people need from them.
Yeah. But I love that answer because it speaks to what I think a lot of people are experiencing right now, where they are not hearing the acknowledgments of what is happening, right? And this could be anything from the election to what's happening in the Middle East to what's happening, in other parts of the world that may impact individuals within the workplace because of their varied backgrounds, right, and experiences, their life experiences. And so, one of the quotes that came back to me was, and this one came up during the Black Lives Matter movement when organizations weren't speaking up, was "Your silence is deafening." Because it was this lack of acknowledgement in what has been happening. And though I am speaking up to share my experiences, it is being ignored. Right. So there's that piece of it. But then there's also this piece of, regardless of what happens in this election cycle, what happens what has been happening actually over the last 2 years with this anti-DEI rhetoric that's been going on. What you can't stop is the diversity that is happening within the world, right? We are becoming much more diverse, much more interconnected. And so that is not going to stop, though there are factions that are trying to stop, certain aspects of that. What is continuing is we have generational diversity that will continue to ebb and flow, right? There are 5 generations in the workforce right now. That's not going to change. Disability, right? At some point, all of us are going to have some type of disability. That is not going to change. And so to ignore or to act like these things are just a fad is really to do a disservice. And so I appreciate how you tied it back to understanding customers and clients, because that is their reality as well too, right? They're going to continue to become more diverse and their needs are going to shift and all of those things. And so to ignore it in the workplace, even if it's from a hiring standpoint, you are missing out because you may not have the right people at the table creating and designing the products and services that are needed to meet the needs of this diverse population. So regardless of kind of, what happens in this election cycle or the next, this work will have to continue to be done. And so when you are working with organizations that are very focused on this work, what are some of the challenges that they are bringing up that you may not have considered, right, as you're designing for them?
Well, I think, one big thing that we recognize often is just how limited the understanding of our clients are relative to their audiences. I think marketing research doesn't dig into some of the realities. Like, let me give you an example. We did a software project. We built a digital product for an organization that served young people. So it would be teenagers in the inner city. And what we found out at the time that I don't think was very well known by the organization itself was that even unhoused young people have phones. So they have access to software, and their phones are their sense of place or their sense of home when they do not have a home or a place. And so it was possible. There was some trepidation around delivering this product because there was this belief that it wouldn't reach some of the critical folks that it needed to reach. And what we were able to disprove in our research was that, in fact, it would have an impact on even the audiences that they didn't expect would have access to it. So I find that, we find that oftentimes our clients are making assumptions about certain audiences that they believe they want to reach or have had impact on in the past. And we're able to counter those assumptions with real research and demonstrate for them how important these tools are. All of this, you and I, you're in Maryland, I'm in Minneapolis. We're talking to each other across the country in real time. And to make assumptions about who has access to this content is, I think, failing to think about belonging. And that's just one tiny example. So, we see it all the time. And I don't think people are, when they come to us, they're trying to solve a transactional problem. They're trying to solve a business problem. They're trying to solve a marketing problem. And I don't know that they're often very cognizant of the inclusion piece of those problems. And, I see myself, but I see Clockwork, my company, as inclusive leaders. And that's part of it. So, it's not our job to shame people for how they think, but it's certainly our job to provide insights that they don't expect. And that's something that I'm particularly proud of.
that example just warms my heart. And I say that because, there continues to be this mindset that this work is just HR work, right? Like it's just this DEI stuff just happens because, it's about employees. And the example that you gave speaks to how it is used in marketing, right? How it's used in product design and development, right? So my last corporate job was leading inclusive marketing, and it was an ongoing battle that I'm like, I don't do HR work, right? I am really focused on understanding our customers and understanding how we can create more inclusive spaces. And the example that you provided, says to me, there are gaps in our understanding, right? And so if there's audiences that we are not reaching, what do we need to do to ensure that we reach them the next time? Or we are now making sure we have someone at the table that will make sure that we are including, this population in our thought process as we design. And it just speaks to what I'm constantly fighting around in how are we creating access to everyone, and what does everyone mean, right? And so we're like, oh, well, this is a product for everyone. Okay, well, who doesn't have access to it? And let's start to think through what that looks like. And so to speak to some of those assumptions, to engage in ways where we're challenging each other, but also opening our minds to other experiences. Right. I think even in just you sharing that story, there may be people that are listening that are like, oh, I didn't even think that people that are unhoused may have a cell phone. And with that cell phone, what does that give them access to? And though there may be some that are doing some judgment in their minds, let's get past the judgment to this is a way of connecting. And so if this is one way of connecting, what else can we connect them to that can help support their needs in ways that they may not be receiving right now, right? So that's kind of how my brain works. Like, oh, wait a minute, there's an avenue. What else can we provide that can create support, right? When I talk about the equity equation, equity to me is how do you remove barriers and provide access?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, one of the things that we also have at Clockwork is we have a group, an accessibility community of practice. So we have a group that really studies accessibility and does additional research, and they coalesce around making our work accessible to all. And really recognizing, you talked about, folks with disabilities earlier in this conversation. And I think that most people who, people who look like me, let's be honest, most cis white folks who walk through the world, aren't thinking outside of themselves because we never had to. And so we make assumptions. And accessibility, needs to be a lens through which we consider all product, all service. And I think that when we are so narrow in our focus, the word diversity conjures up people of color, perhaps for most people, but we're not thinking about the broad swath of consideration that is necessary for us to truly make product accessible. And if I may, Sacha, I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, I live in Minneapolis. And my company is 23 years old. And and this is not a humble brag. This is something that I'm proud of. But 5 years before George Floyd was murdered in our backyard, and I say that metaphorically, just in case there's any confusion, we came out very strongly and said, as an organization, when companies were afraid of it, Black Lives Matter. And we made that statement. We wrote a bit of a manifesto about why we felt that way. And our staff was very grateful. I mean, the interesting thing about it was I can create an environment where everyone feels safe. I can pull people together in very intentional ways. I can pursue external training from consultants like yourself. We've certainly done a significant amount of anti-racism work and pulled in folks who can help us see things more clearly. But nothing had the same kind of impact as naming it, saying it, standing by it, and infusing it in everything that we do. And when Mr. Floyd lost his life so tragically and so avoidably, we were already there. And our people inside of Clockwork and inside of Tempo already knew what we stood for. And we closed immediately and let our staff show up in their communities to support their neighbors and their friends and their families very actively. The rhetoric that we hear is that Minneapolis is a post-apocalyptic nightmare. It is not.
It's not.
Because the communities showed up for each other. And what that police officer did is not represent. We've got a lot of work to do. I acknowledge that. This city has a ton of work to do. And we squandered an opportunity when the whole world was looking for us to demonstrate what could be done. I don't believe we showed up well. But I do believe that the people of this city, for the most part, and certainly so many folks that I know from the professional community, want things to be different and are still moving in a direction that a lot of people have abandoned, to your point, but we're still committed to changing what it feels like, quite frankly, for Black folks to live here. Yeah. I mean, and that is the most plain spoken way for me to say it. There's a woman here. She's a friend of mine, Nakima Levy Armstrong. She ran for mayor. She's an attorney. She's a professor. She is an activist. And she wrote an article, I think it was in the Atlantic before Mr. Floyd was murdered. And she talked about how difficult it is to be a Black person in Minnesota, how we get all these awards for being the best city to bike in and the best city to live in and the most affordable, whatever. And she was like, why aren't we paying attention to how homogenized and ignorant this place is? And it was eye-opening. And then Philando Castile was murdered here. And so I think people were shaken awake in some ways. And there's still so much work to be done. But I don't believe that's the work of activists alone or the work of social workers alone or the work of HR alone. It is the work of businesses to take some. And if people don't like me because of it, then so be it. So be it. But I have a job that isn't just digital stuff. I have a job to do in my community. And it starts with naming it and pushing back against it and demonstrating how different attitude and energy can work. And I'm not leaving Minneapolis. I'm going to stay here and make it better because we all deserve better. So sorry, I went on my soapbox a little bit, but
no, and I love that because it speaks to, things that I've been saying on the show for a while, right? The importance of community. We just recorded, another episode, an earlier episode, talking about how this work is what we do after 5 o'clock, right? It is, we talk about the training and all the work that we do from 9 to 5. And DEI After 5 for me now is really like, what is the work that we do after 5 o'clock? What are we doing in our communities, in our homes, all of those things, because that's how we create that change. And so what you're saying is the workplace, or this is how it's landing for me, is the workplace is that linchpin. It is the foundation of how we impact our communities, right? If we're doing the right things in our workplaces and we are showing care and concern and making sure that people belong and giving them the time, the grace and space, I say that all the time, right? The grace and space to feel the feels, regardless of what's happening, that is going to help us figure out, how do we do this in community? How do we stay in community, right? Any email that I send out to my email list, I end it with always in community, because we need to be very diligent in what that looks like. And I cannot be successful. I cannot do what I do without being in community, without sharing space. And so that's what I'm hearing from you. It's being intentional, standing firm in, what it is that you believe, and modeling that behavior through the work that you do. So it's not just putting it on the cafeteria wall. These are our beliefs, right? You painted it great. It's a mural, wonderful, but then you're acting a fool. That's not the word that was going to come out of my mouth, but acting a fool, right? Day to day. Like, no, you have to embody those things. And so what I am hearing is this embodiment of inclusion, this embodiment of belonging, this embodiment of understanding that we are uniquely made, and that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. And Minneapolis is an interesting place too, because we are surrounded by Fortune 500 companies. So General Mills is here, and Target, and 3M, and Honeywell, and I mean the list is vast, and that's another reason why my business is here. And I have a friend who shall remain nameless, who worked for a company that shall remain nameless. But I'm just a little company, right? We're a small company. There's these behemoths here. And I have a friend who worked her way up for 22 years inside of one of those behemoths till she got to the leadership table. And she sat there with the CEO, and I'm talking a big one. And this company waffled on LGBTQ plus, on their position around LGBTQ plus rights. And they refused to take a stand. They had, and then they got some flack from their customers. So they pulled back. And my friend happens to be queer and happens to have a trans kid. And after 22 years, and here's we don't know a lot about what works inside of those big companies, except for maybe your past experience or our experience in working with them. But we do know that those people that are at the leadership table make a lot of money.
Yeah.
And this friend of mine opted to leave after investing her entire career, because on principle, she could not stay in a place that did not see her family as whole and human and deserving of love and respect. And I have nothing but admiration for her. And I believe her story is of value to so many folks. And I think we're going to see more and more of that, because as you mentioned earlier, the world is simply becoming more diverse, and you can't just vote that away. It doesn't just disappear because you don't like it. And all of us, all humans, are good and deserving of love and respect because we were born, not because somebody else decides, right? And we have to start living that truth in wherever we are in our lives, in our businesses, in our homes, in our communities, our schools, our churches, because those examples that we set, but also the power we carry, is what's going to change everybody else. So her moment, her move, her big risk, what a life she gave up, right? I mean, she'll land someplace else, it'll be fine. But what a risk to turn away from that kind of security, but also a lifestyle that most people can't even imagine, right? Because it's not about money. It's about humanity and the fact that nobody matters more than anybody else. And it's incumbent upon all of us, because companies can't do it. They're too afraid. So it's incumbent upon individuals to make these moves, to lead by example, to take these risks. And my friend is white and cis as well. And so quite frankly, it's incumbent upon us, white folks with power, to be bold and to be courageous and to put our money where our mouth is. Because to your point, it's not just hanging the values on the wall. Your values can't be aspirational. They have to be true. And it starts with us.
I love it. I love it. I love it. So Nancy, what are the things that you do to take care of you? Like, this is some tough work, but I've been to Minneapolis a few times. It's a great place to just, chill, relax. So like, what are the things that you do to kind of unwind?
Yeah. Well, the next time you're in Minneapolis, please call.
Will do.
Yeah. It's outside for me. I don't know if you're a person of faith, but I believe that God is everywhere, all around us. And so I get outside to remind myself that I am small, and the world around me is huge. And the negative stuff, it's not everything. It just is so distracting that sometimes we forget. And so for me, it's being outside. I have a Vespa scooter and I have an e-bike, and both of those things bring me into the outside in ways that I really appreciate. Although I fell off my Vespa the other day and bruised my knee up, and it was awful. But I'm getting back on it because it really brings me joy. It's being outside. I also, about a year ago, I started hosting what I call badass happy hours. And I was very intentional about curating a list of super amazing badass women that I learn from, that I admire, just a wildly diverse, really interesting, fabulous group of women. And we actually just had an event a couple of nights ago, and we don't want anything from each other. It's an opportunity for some people to make new friends. It's an opportunity for us to see people we don't see often enough. And honestly, when I'm in that room with those women, I'm reminded of the leaders in my community that I admire so much. And they give me fuel. So, and that's really intentional. And, really making a point to not be lonely, because, I'm an introvert, and I don't seem like one. Everybody else, nobody ever believes me when I say that, but it's true.
Same.
And that just, see, I just like to be alone sometimes to refuel. It doesn't mean I don't love people. I do. But it's really easy to crawl inside yourself. And so, I just think making time for good friends.
It's so funny you say that. I woke up this morning like, I don't think I've left my house in 3 days. Because I'm just,
I get it.
Like, yeah, I'm good. I'm happy. But no, I love that. I love that. In the badass happy hours, I love that idea too.
Yeah.
Because again, that's being in community, right? Like that's that part. So Nancy, if folks wanted to get in contact with you, what is the best way for them to do that?
Well, they can find me on my website, which is nancylyons.com. I'd love for them to know about my company, clockwork.com. We also have a studio that works to build digital products for small and medium-sized businesses and startups. That's Tempo, and the website is made by Tempo. .com. Sorry about that. I probably gave you that information, and it's not real. So I don't know who Designed by Tempo is, but good on them.
Made by Tempo. Okay.
Yeah, madebytempo.com. And I'm on TikTok, which I don't know why, but I am. My handle on TikTok is Nansplainer, and on Insta it's Nylons.
Love it. Nancy, thank you so much for spending time with us today. I mean, I think that there's so much that we as leaders need to keep in mind during these times, because like you said, this is not new. We will continue to have these times of unrest or uncertainty. And, what I'm kind of taking out, the nuggets I'm taking out of this is really to just stand firm in your beliefs and your values and live them. And regardless of what happens in the world, you're going to have a strong foundation in those beliefs. And that's what's going to continue to keep you moving forward and inspiring others. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I truly appreciate it.
Thank you. It went really fast. I appreciate the conversation too. It was delightful.
Absolutely. And thank you all for tuning in. I hope you were able to walk away with a couple of nuggets that you will be able to take to work and home and within your communities. And as always, you can find us here every Tuesday at 5:15 p.m. Eastern on whatever platform you use for your podcasts, Spotify and others, as well as YouTube. And as always, be sure to like, share, and subscribe. And until next time, have a good one.